Right, so today my search for transformational objects takes me to Magdalene College, Cambridge, and I'm delighted to meet with Professor Simon Stoddart, who is Professor in Prehistory. Hello, Simon.
Good to meet you.
Yes, and you too, and thanks so much for having this conversation with me. And I believe that you've got not one but three objects for me that we can have a chat about. And in particular, I think you've got a replica or a model of a Maltese artefact. Would you like to tell me a little bit about that and why you've selected it for me?
Well, this was as you put it, a transformative object that we first found in 1991. Professor Caroline Malone and I, with our Maltese colleagues, were directing an excavation on the island of Gozo, and unexpectedly, in a very well-defined area of this funerary complex, often called a circle, we discovered these twin figures seated on a bed. And they are about the size of the palms of a hand. They're not very, very large, and they would have been able to stand in this sacred area, presiding over the arrival of the latest deceased individuals of the local village. And this particular object was found behind a screen. It had fallen over. It had probably been deliberately backfilled into this part of the site, and therefore we know that it was a protected sacred object. And therefore that spatial context is very, very important, because around about this particular object were many human remains, not buried in an articulated fashion such as you'd find in a modern graveyard, or at least usually in a modern graveyard. In this case, there was a whole process of dismemberment of the bodies. So a body would arrive intact and then be distributed over a period of time into different parts of this large underground cave system. And we consider this object to have been very important in presiding over this process. If we read this object, I will describe it to you, and you no doubt see images in the exhibition that is about to open in Cambridge. On one side there is a person who is rather corpulent, who is holding a representation of themselves. On the other side there is someone holding a small cup. And the way in which we see this is as the beginning and end. We have the first person who is showing a small representation of themselves, a kernel of what they will be as a personality later in life. And the second person is holding what happens at the end of that life, when every single person who came into this cave system, we suspect, was accompanied by one of these small bowls that is held by the second individual. So, in a sense, this object encapsulates the story of life, the beginning and the end, and yet also eternity as well, because around the two individuals there is a skirt that represents the fact that even if the individuals disappear, the descent group or the actual identity of the group on the small island of Gozo will continue. So it's a promise for the future, as well as respecting the past and showing the individuality of the people who pass through this process, as indeed we do today. So it has a redolence for our own lives. We are passing objects in time, and therefore the silence that we see in prehistory is broken open into a chorus of music that we can actually see in these particular objects. We can imagine, we can see, we can reenact. And indeed, in the first publication that we did of this particular object in its context in 2009, my wife, Caroline Malone, the professor from Queen's Belfast, actually did an almost sort of a novelesque sort of reconstruction of how these objects were put in place, how they presided over the dying or the dead who were brought into this particular cave system. So we can get beyond the silence of the objects and give them an enormous understanding, with the proviso that this is our view of the past. In other words, we need to be very careful. This is like any perception of art. It is the observer who interprets what they see, and there may be multiple interpretations, but this is the one that I think, using anthropological information, both the bodies themselves and of the art and comparisons in other parts of the world, we can begin to situate this very transformative object into a wider sphere of understanding.
That's fantastically put, and what I love is well, your enthusiasm for it, and that almost a little bit like storytelling, or bringing it back to life, making it present across the great ages, but also how important and how relevant the ideas behind it still are. And what I'm finding in my travels and looking for objects of transformation is, or rather I'm wondering, is whether we are starting to lose some of those connections to these bigger issues, these wider stories, and our place in the world, and so on. I don't know if that's the case or not, but what is either way is great is how this reminds us of it and connects us back to it.
I think the shared theme is in fact death, and death is a process. Today, I think one big lesson of this particular discovery that we made is that we do not die just like that in a flash. It is a process, it's a very social process. And this particular pairing of individuals on this bed show that there is an involvement of the community in a funeral. And something I think that we need to learn is that we shouldn't put death into a hospital cupboard, if I can put it that way, but involve ourselves. The whole idea of a wake, of, if I can put, replacing the key individual who's left our lives with a process of ritual. And this is what we see really encapsulated in this object and the context in which we found it.
Thank you. Yes, and it's that sense of reconnecting with our own mortality and squaring up to it. But that also then provides us with a much more holistic view of the world, and in terms of the pickle that we've got ourselves into, trying to change that and trying to turn the boat around. One of them must surely be to ground ourselves again in these cycles of life and death and respect and all of these things that are symbolised in that object.
And I think there's another connection which you are alluding to, in that we live in a very fragile earth. And the communities that are behind these particular objects were very conscious of that. And they set up these enormous monuments, which were the largest freestanding, or are the largest freestanding monuments in the world even today. We have to use the words very carefully, because there's a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which is much older, but isn't a freestanding monument in quite the same way. But they had this enormous achievement, and they did this in order to give themselves a point of stability in a very fragile landscape. They were very conscious, as far as we can see, of the fact that when the rains came, which came in great storms, they did flush away all the sediments on which their agriculture was based. And indeed, if you go up today in a helicopter, they couldn't do that then, but you can do that today, after a rainstorm, you see the Mediterranean Sea being transformed into a brown from its natural blue. And this is a perennial problem. And the way they solved this, and this is particularly a theory that has been developed in the Fraxus project, this European project headed by Professor Caroline Malone, who happens also to be my wife. She has developed this idea that, together with geoarchaeologists and other scholars, that round these so-called temples, which we now call clubhouses. I think this is a much more socially relevant way of talking about them. They did have performances and rituals, but they were very much gathered around the community, a community action. They actually had gardens around these so-called temples or clubhouses, which were maintained with enormous care. So in order to avoid the flushing out of the sediments, the maintenance of agriculture, and curate the maintenance of our agriculture, they really looked after the soils around these particular monuments. And of course, if you look in the fields today, we know about erosion. We see floods in this country and in many others. So there's in a capsule, in minuscule, there is a lesson here from tiny Malta, only 318 square kilometres, can fit easily within the M25 in London. This small landscape, 2,500 years BC, can give us enormous lessons about how we need to curate our landscape. One of the ways in which they did it, which perhaps not all of us do today, would be to engage in rituals. But what we can agree with is that you do need to look after the landscape in which you dwell. And indeed, the project, which was the centre of this, funded by the European Union, was all to do with fragility and resilience. How do you create a landscape that can cope with the fragility in which we find ourselves in our daily lives? We all have, and indeed the fact that this object comes from a mini landscape of death shows that fragility of all our lives. And yet you've got to think of posterity, you've got to think of legacy, you've got to think of the fact that you're transferring this landscape onto your successors. And they clearly, I think what we can read from these objects, they had a profound sense of legacy that you can read through the symbolism of the objects themselves.
So I'm delighted that you're able to let us induct a model of this Maltese artefact into our library. But I'm also aware that I believe you've also got some souvenirs and other manifestations of the same object. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
If you go to the airport of Malta or go to the souvenir shops, you'll find a plethora of re-representations of this very object. To give you a sense of this, it appeared on the stamps, on the phone cards, and also various celebrative medals from particular sites, particularly Gigantea, which is closely associated with the cemetery from which we found this object. But it goes deeper than that, because Malta is famous for a number of particular cultural apparitions, if I could put. Doors have a particular character to them, different colours. And on those doors, they have made a particular point of developing a line in different door knockers. And these are brass, they're very prominent, they're very beautiful, they're very well formed and decorated. Now, the normal door knocker is a Maltese cross. But the more enterprising of these door knocker makers have actually chosen a series of archaeological artefacts. One comes from a site called Scorba, but the one that we have in the exhibition is actually a re-representation in brass of the object that is there in reality. So here is this sophisticated representation that you will be reminded of every time you visit a particular house by gently knocking on the door of that particular house.
The criticism of kitsch and souvenirs is the trivialising of the original. I mean, do you see these when we talked about the transformative effect and the powerful resonances that it has? So do you see the transformation of it into a door knocker or into a key fob or a whatever as a good or a bad progression?
I think it's very positive in its entirety. It allows someone who only has €1 to spend to buy into this heritage. And so you can put a fridge magnet on the wall of your fridge in a way that you cannot own the object itself. Indeed, it is the patrimony, it will always be in the museum. And indeed, the object we have on display is itself a plaster cast, to make that absolutely clear, but a very good plaster cast. So people, be they from abroad or from Malta itself, can experience this object at a level and at a cost that they consider worthy or appropriate for their own means. And so I think this is something that it is reducing it to particular types of essence that perhaps also confuse the message. But nevertheless, this passion for something that is deeply embedded in the landscape of a particular location is really, I think, fantastic. And it's what drives us as human beings to understand not only ourselves in the present day, but also to ground ourselves in the past as a security in some ways for looking towards the future. And I think there are ways in which this archaeology can inform at a minuscule level. After all, the world of the prehistoric Maltese was as large as the world is for us today, if that makes sense. In other words, we can travel in a way that prehistoric Maltese could not. Crossing to Sicily was possible, and it wasn't it was not something that was particularly dangerous, but you had to choose your moment. To travel to America, I have to choose my moment, so that the scales are sort of comparable in terms of technology, and we have to insert that technological framework. So if we take that technological sort of framework and reimagine it as appropriate for the particular prehistoric world as opposed to the modern world, then we can make comparisons between the difficulties that the prehistoric Maltese found themselves in and the difficulties that we now find ourselves in with climate change. The prehistoric Maltese faced climatic issues. There were particular events that we can measure globally, which they had to respond to at their local level in the same way as we are having to respond today.
I was thinking, and as I was coming over here, what can prehistory and things from such a long time ago tell us about our predicament today? And you've summed that up perfectly, and this object, it will be a great addition to our library. So thank you so much for that. But I do know also that you've got a couple of others that are equally fascinating, and maybe we could have a quick review of both of those. And I'm looking ahead. On the table, you have got a flint hand axe.
This reveals a number of parallel lessons, if I can put it this way. We don't know where this came from. This is what we call an unprovenanced artefact. So we think it came from the Thames gravels, and this is highly probable. But when we came into our possession, we didn't have any knowledge, and that is a great loss. So we're dependent here on the object itself, which is very beautiful. I mean, it's a simple beauty. It's a beauty of a very stylized form, and it would have taken skill to do this. It's not something that I personally could do. The symmetry is another thing. There is a sense here that here we are dealing with at least 100,000 years ago or more. Then there's the question of what was this used for? And here there have been many, many theories. One thing is that a good hand axe fits beautifully in the hand, and there's also a left and a right aspect to it. It may fit, I'm right-handed, and I feel it fits rather better in my right hand than my left hand. And that there is a level of intentionality that we can actually master.
Amazing. Can I?
You can certainly handle it.
So, incredible to think that I'm holding something that 100,000 years ago.
Plus or minus.
Yeah.
Because this is the problem of chronology of that period. Till you've got the chronometric methods of the context.
And it does feel really nice in the hand.
It does fit in the hand.
It just fits in the palm of the hand.
It absolutely does.
Yes. And I'm intrigued that you are using it with the ball and the heavy weight down as to compress or to crush. I was thinking maybe it was like a kind of more of a knife, but either way, it's a fantastic.
It could be either. You're quite right. Yes.
Well, it is incredible and astonishing, and it does fit like a glove. But in the context of transformation, we were talking earlier about the Maltese artefact, and that had a spiritual dimension and an existential dimension, whereas this has got so much more of a practical dimension and shows how we as humans are starting on our kind of road to mastery, as it were, of our surroundings.
Absolutely.
So a different flavour of transformation.
It does have a different flavour. You're quite right. If you want to talk about transformative qualities, one thing that is true also that period is that change, as seen through the artefacts, and I'm being very careful what I'm saying here, is quite slow. So there are long periods when this sort of artefact would have been very prominent, and then time speeds up, at least seen technologically, as we moved more towards the present. And of course, in our present day, the mobile phone that I have is not the mobile phone that my children will want because it's out of fashion. So matters change much more quickly, and achievements take place that I would never have dreamt of when I was a child. And yet my children will have the same experience when they move on in life. So the speed of technological transformation is ever increasing. The fear is that speed will lead to destruction, of course, which is a sort of a rather poignant thing to end on. And we have this image, don't we, of the clock approaching midnight in terms of Armageddon, and we're getting closer. Sometimes we move a little bit away, and then we move closer again. And we are, in a way, teetering on that edge of this technological process. I almost said progress, but is it progress or process? This is the dilemma that we're considering at this present time.
Indeed, and that's precisely where the Library of the Great Silence is situated, around this idea that, well, are we heading in a direction and maybe we need to put the brakes on a little bit, or have a little bit of a rethink. And dare I say it, your final object is commemorative in a way. It's a coin that was stamped to celebrate or to commemorate the exit of the UK from the European Union, aka Brexit.
Absolutely. So this is a very small 50p coin, and it was struck twice, and you may remember why, because the first time was a little bit too early, may I say. This, I think the original ones that were struck had to be melted down again, because of course we remember this political process whereby Brexit was challenged by a whole series of people, by marches and by the lawyers, and ultimately, well, Brexit, I'm not sure it has ever been done. I don't think we'll ever see it fully done, because it is a process in itself, and we'll only appreciate the consequences, be they positive or negative, over a long period of time. But what individuals and communities like to do is mark particular moments. And this is a coin that has on one side the Queen, and on the other side a quotation, which I'm going to ask you to read because I've left my spectacles behind. But it was basically a celebration of... can you read it?
Yes, it says, "Peace, prosperity and friendship with all nations."
And there is a particular ideology there, because I would say, in a way, if I were to dissect Brexit, in a way, Brexit was a breaking apart. And yet here is, ironically, a celebration of bringing together. And I just leave that hanging, because coins are... We see this in the Roman world, we see it in many other later periods as well. They are political artifacts, and they convey a message which may run alongside the actual direction of the political process, or they may try and weigh it or direct it in a slightly different alternative view of the world. And I'm not going to enter into the politics, although you may hear a ring of my perspective on this. Indeed, many academics share that. But I see deep irony in this particular object, partly because of the temporality of it. It had to be done twice, if I remember rightly. And this is the much less rare object that was actually coined later, when Brexit actually, the legality of Brexit took place. But there was this earlier period. And secondly, the message is to convey a sort of global friendship, as opposed to what the practitioners of Brexit would see as a rather more localised Brexit, which would be European in its perspective.
Parking for now the pros and cons, just the idea in terms of transformative processes, that political dimension, you've brought yet another twist, another way of thinking about transformation, and the real politic, as it were, the fact of people having to muddle and make do and compromise or work things out in these kind of messy relations, which is what politics is all about. And so by sharing that object, that commemorative coin with us, you've articulated another dimension.
Objects are very powerful, but they exert their power in different ways according to the receiver. And so it's a bit like art more generally. And yet, if you put a powerful message on something like a coin, you can direct that message in the particular way in which you wish it to be interpreted, and therefore have a power over the people that you're directing the message against or in support of.
Well, maybe that is the perfect place at which to say thank you so much for this conversation. It's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you for letting us loan these objects into our library.
It's been my pleasure.